Oh,
Oh, it says,
there we go. Hey, everyone. This is Nomiki Konst. You are watching The Nomiki Show. And in the ongoing saga of Iowa Gate, we are going to be diving deeper into the DNC as promised. I didn't expect to be launching a show to discuss the issues with the establishment and break down the infrastructure and just go right into it from the get-go. But this was the week to do it. So if you are not already doing so, please become a patron at patreon.com/thenomikishow, and please subscribe on our YouTube channel, because this has been a lot of work this week. We're a very, very small team, and we only want to provide better content. We want to do more explainers, how these organizations are structured, what are their tactics, what we can do. We want to do more in-depth interviews with great thinkers and idea leaders and organizers, and we want to provide more analysis as to what's going on, stuff that the mainstream media doesn't provide, but also, because I've sort of been on the inside, provide a little insider take so that the outside can push back against the inside and create real progress. On that note, my friend Michael Kapp is a DNC member. He is the chair of the Youth Council of the DNC. We will talk about that. I'm a former member of that Youth Council, but Michael's also up for re-election right now for his DNC membership spot in California, a place where they actually have elections for the DNC, unlike other states like my state, New York. But Michael has been really on the reform side of the Democratic Party and is having, some very smart takes on what's going on. He's been talking with me, giving me a little bit of a perspective of how things went down in Iowa, what the DNC members knew. And unlike most people in the DNC, even on the reform side, he is willing to talk about it out loud. So Michael, thank you so much. Thank you for taking a pause from your campaigning. Let's first talk about that. What does it mean to be a DNC member?
I think the most important thing that a DNC member should do is communicate to grassroots activists, not just in your state, but around the country, so everyone knows what's going on at the DNC. When I first ran for the DNC 4 years ago, everyone I spoke with said they don't really know what the DNC does. I live in Los Angeles now, and we have more DNC members in Los Angeles than most states have. But even then, I didn't know what the DNC was doing. So I made a promise to the people that I was campaigning to that I would do my best to try to break down the black box of the DNC and shine a light in what's going on there, what initiatives are being put forth, what I'm doing there, and importantly, how DNC members are voting on these issues, whether it's a new DNC chair or officers, on superdelegate reform and the convention rules, or a climate debate, because these are things that impact all Democrats and Democratic-leaning voters, but only a select few, for whatever reason, has access to this information. It's my job to break down those barriers and make sure that I communicate as much as possible.
It's interesting because I've heard a lot of DNC members say that not until recently have they really had much of a purpose other than coming to events, raising money, cheering in crowds. What's your experience been like? Because you sort of joined the DNC as the duties grew, but really at the end of the day, I mean, how much are you really given those duties?
There aren't really set responsibilities or duties of being a DNC member. Like most volunteer unpaid positions in the party, it's really what you put into it that matters. I was told when I ran 4 years ago that, when we have the White House, when we have a Democratic president, they choose the chair, all the officers, they approve all the resolutions before it even goes to the body, and the body just rubber stamps what's happening. So we all figured going into 2016 that Hillary Clinton would win. This was already in the general election. And I was okay with that because I wanted to spend time learning about the organization, trying to build relationships with people outside of my state of California. So when we do have a opportunity to make change in our national party, we would be able to move forward quickly and do that. It happened far more quickly than anyone expected because, of course, Hillary did not win. And then it was a free-for-all. It was who's going to be leading our party in this dark era of Trump. And,
when you look at the DNC membership, and we've talked about this on other shows, but just as a reminder to everybody, there are about 440 or so members. And of the 440, how many are elected, give or take, percentage-wise?
So it really depends on how you define elected, because according to the DNC's bylaws, about 200 of those 440 are directly elected by the states. That's allocated to the state parties by population and Democratic voter registration. So here in California, we have roughly 10% of the national population. We have 20 elected DNC members. And all throughout the country, it's always divided in half by gender, because the DNC still hasn't updated our gender inclusivity rules. So hopefully that's something that can be changed moving forward. But that's only 200. Then every state party chair and vice chair of the opposite gender are ex officio on the DNC. They're also elected. They're just not elected in the same election that DNC members are elected in. Then we have Democratic affiliated organizations like the Democratic Governors Association, the DMO, Young Democrats of America. Those organizations all hold elections, but it's, again, within their organization. And there's probably another 100, maybe a little bit more from those Democratic affiliated organizations. And then you have the 75 quote unquote at large DNC members that under the DNC's bylaws, it clearly states that they have to be elected by the full DNC membership to ensure that we reach diversity goals. But in actuality, what happens is that they're presented to the full DNC as a slate. There's no opportunity to pull names or discussion, and you have to vote up or down on those. So those are essentially an appointment, but under the bylaws, by the chair. But under the bylaws, it should be an election. But all we do is the DNC rubber stamps it.
And just as a side note here, when I was on the Unity Reform Commission, we attempted to eliminate slate candidacies. And the pushback was, what, we don't trust the chair? Well, yeah, that's what accountability is. It doesn't mean that, and I remember saying this on, giving the chair, and of course, I don't trust the chair now, but at the time I said, even if you gave him credit, you still want to have those checks and balances. It's like the old rule of Judaism. Always have one person at the table who has an opposite opinion to dissent. Yeah. Even if they don't agree, you just need one person to dissent.
Yes. And it's all about, like, I am a DNC member just like Tom Perez. Why can't I push forward a slate of individuals to be elected as those 75 at large? Because there's no mechanism for it.
Yeah.
And if we want to make sure that the DNC is responsive to the needs of state parties, to support state parties, which support county parties and Democratic clubs, who actually do the hard work of organizing and building out the infrastructure so we can win up and down the ballot, then we need to have a voice at the table. And even though we have 200 plus who are elected from the states, we're really sidelined. And that's what it comes down to.
So this is really fascinating to me, because when you see these lists come out, and thank God they're finally getting a little bit more attention, because in the past, I don't even know if they press released who these appointments were, but now they're press releasing. What progress. But you see who's on these lists, and the chair has chosen people that are from his appointment, his at-large members, to be on the Rules Committee of the Convention, the Delegate Selection Committee, the Credentials Committee, excuse me, and it's kind of crazy to me, because he's essentially picking his appointees over the folks who are out there hustling like you right now in your election to be DNC members. And it's a kind of a middle finger to people who worked very, very hard to represent their states, and for whatever reason, whatever their agenda is on the DNC, he's choosing his people over the elected folks.
Right, and it's a problem internal to the DNC itself. The DNC has four standing committees, but the vast majority of the appointments made by the chair to those DNC standing committees are from the 75 at-large appointed DNC members, as opposed to those of us who are elected from our state parties. It's really hard to run for DNC, no matter what state you're coming from, because if you're from a smaller state, like Minnesota or Wyoming, you're only talking about less than 5 DNC spots. Here in California, we have 20, but it's a huge state. And it's hard to run here too. It's expensive and you have to take time off work and travel and everything. You have to do the same thing in those smaller states. And when you look at DNC members who are elected from state parties that actually have open and fair elections for DNC, some of these people are the best organizers and activists that you will ever meet, but they will not have much of a voice at the DNC because they're completely sidelined by appointments to DNC committees and other avenues of making change because they're not appointed by the chair.
So let's talk about some of these committees and what power they have, because one of the things that we want to do on the show is pull back the curtain and kind of deconstruct how this all works. So we know where to shine light, we know where to push back specifically, rather than just saying like the DNC is corrupt. Well, you're a great guy. You're not corrupt. You're pushing for reform, but also to know where to hold the accountability. So let's take, say, the Rules Committee, okay? Not the Rules Committee for the convention. Let's just say the General Rules Committee, the Standing Committee. What does the Rules Committee do?
So they're the ones who process all the delegate selection plans for the presidential primary process. They also tackle any bylaws changes that come before the committee. So if you control the committee because you're the chair and those are your appointments, then you're only going to want to see changes come through that you as the chair support. Doesn't matter if the full body or at least the ones who are elected from the states, if they have other concerns. At the end of the day, the DNC is a federation, a loose federation of state parties, all 57 of them. That's the 50 states plus the territories and DC. But if we don't have a seat at the table, then we're just ignored. So really, what is the point of the DNC? And that's the problem that I see.
Well, you have really amazing conferences and big speakers like Michelle Obama at the women's event, and it's a rah-rah event, right?
Well, you'd need some rah-rah events in order to raise money, but we haven't been doing a good job of that anyway.
Don't worry, Michael Bloomberg gave $350,000. You're going to be fine.
Yeah, that's not the kind of money that I'm really interested in. I was hoping that the DNC membership and the chair would listen to our grassroots when it came to the climate debate, which was really opening up the primary so we could have single issue debates on everything from women's right to choose to criminal justice reform to environmental justice, the whole host of issues of questions that are never asked at these debates. Because I knew if we had passed the climate debate, if we had passed single issue debates, that day would have been the single largest day of small dollar donations to the DNC. And we just threw it back into the face of the grassroots. And that was a big missed opportunity.
So I'm going to throw some rapid fire questions at you to illustrate a point.
Okay.
Did the DNC membership vote on how the debates would be conducted?
No.
Did the DNC membership vote on whether or not to spend money on the Shadow app?
No.
Did the DNC membership vote on what contracts were going to be given out? See where I'm going with this? Did the DNC membership vote on who was going to be on the rules committee of the convention? Did the DNC membership vote on who the COO, CEO, and executive team would be? No.
No.
Did the DNC membership vote on how many debates there would be?
No.
Okay. So who decided these things?
It's the chair. It's the chair. The chair has almost unilateral power at the DNC. And for the few things that we might have some influence on. The chair automatically has 75 votes in his pocket. And then on top of that, you have all the Democratic affiliated organizations, most of which are, by their very nature, establishment. Then you have DNC members elected from states that are entirely top down, and where you don't have free and fair elections for DNC. And so it's hard to fight back against that. But we have a lot of great people, dozens of DNC members all throughout the country, who are organizing as much as we can to push pro-transparency reforms at the DNC.
So one of the things that we got a lot of pushback from on the Unity Reform Commission, and just to remind people, the Unity Reform Commission was set up to change to reform the Democratic Party as a whole, and also to reform the primary process and superdelegate process, primary and caucus process. And we didn't have any power other than issuing a report of recommendations that were decided on. Not, a reminder that the Bernie group was in the minority on that, so we were outnumbered. So it was already watered down. The report was delivered. And then it was delivered to the Rules Committee, which again was appointed by Tom Perez. And then the Rules Committee essentially watered it down even more so, and then took it to the DNC greater membership as a whole in August of 2018 to vote on it. And one of the things that we pushed for was, and Dr. Zogby, Jim Zogby, who's been on the show before, has discussed this at length, is to have some sort of accountability and oversight. Yes, transparency was a huge area of debate, budget transparency, accountability, oversight of contracts like the shadow contract. But also when those bylaws are not followed, which happens quite often, what happens? And so I wonder if, most DNC members didn't follow the Unity Reform Commission in depth. You did. You were very active. A lot of them caught up once it came down to time for the vote, because it was a long process. It was, the meetings were not, on TV. They weren't issued reports or updates. It was a pretty difficult process to go through. Very confusing if you weren't an expert on presidential primaries. So is there a conversation right now within the DNC on what happens when the bylaws of the party are not followed or violated?
It depends on what you mean by within the DNC. Within grassroots DNC members, certainly there is. Within the DNC leadership and those in our headquarters in Washington, I don't think so. I don't think so.
There was a lot of discussion and promise about a 50-state strategy. Has that happened?
It has. It's certainly an improvement over the previous 8 years. We've tripled the investments into state parties. We have a grant program where states can apply for additional funds on top of the baseline that each state party receives. Mm-hmm. I've heard complaints from different state parties that the grant process is so obtuse and so strict that many state parties, which are, let's face it, barely functional, don't really have much in terms of paid staff. The rules are really hard to follow, but that goes to the point where you have people running our national party who haven't had party experience before, and they don't know how state parties are run, and so they don't know how we can be most effective. We have invested in state parties better than we have in the 8 years under Barack Obama, but that bar is just, it's so low. We should be doing a lot better.
Why is it important to invest in state parties? I mean, especially coming out of Iowa, people think, oh, the states are inept. But we'll get to that in a second. But why is this important?
Because it's at the state level, at the grassroots level, that we actually get things done, where we have people knock on doors, make phone calls for our endorsed candidates. And if we don't build up the bench, then we don't have anyone to run for anything. And we lost over 1,000 state legislative seats, just state legislatures, in the 8 years of Barack Obama. And we've come back, we've won back maybe 625 of those. But we're still down and we still need to do better. And it's not just the state legislatures. It's about city councils and school boards and water boards. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of elections where we don't have any registered Democrats running. And if we can't give the people an option, they're just going to go with the Republicans. They do a much better job than Democrats do in making sure that they run people up and down the ballot. And Democrats, we don't.
Yeah, I mean, the Koch brothers famously have been investing in state legislatures and states, including Democratic, what used to be known as Democratic states, seeing the population decrease in terms of ideology. They knew that they needed to kind of get ahead of this, and they've been very effective at that, especially in the Rust Belt, where they could fight unions and attempt to privatize at local levels, whether it's the water boards or education. So when you don't have Democrats, solid D Democrats, progressive Democrats running on what has traditionally been the message of the Democratic Party, even just being pro, teachers, for instance, that's every campaign is an opportunity to get the message out, and whether you win or lose. So, let's talk a little bit about Iowa, because this is obviously a big topic. It's very revealing of how the Democratic Party is the ineptitudes of the Democratic Party and where blame shifts. But, okay, the Unity Reform Commission, Bernie people got blamed for these, reforms in the Iowa caucuses. I have my own opinions about that. There were plenty of Hillary people on the Reform Commission who wanted those reforms, including Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's worked in Iowa, Emmy Ruiz, who worked in Nevada. But with that being said, we wouldn't have those numbers if we didn't have those reforms. Reform has never revealed has never been bad. What was bad, and I think was a distraction, was the fact that we were handing out a contract to an app company that really had already been warned was not working, but also did not go through real vetting. What's the vibe right now with DNC members in terms of where the blame is, what went wrong? I mean, how are people feeling about Tom Perez at this point?
I think people are horrified at what's happened in Iowa, because it could really happen anywhere when you don't have strong state parties who are deeply focused on making sure that we have a free and fair election. We're going to have issues. And Iowa, top to bottom, they're not too bad.
Right.
They know that they're
being good.
I know. And they know that they really want to keep their first in the nation status. And vast majority of DNC members, at least the ones elected from the states, we have no patience for that. For Iowa, New Hampshire, they often vote as a block on the DNC chair's race. And at some point, when we have a Democratic president, they're probably going to want to keep Iowa, New Hampshire's primacy in this primary, because they want to make sure that they get reelected. And so we can't keep having states that are not representative leading our primary, because these first four states, especially the first two, are not at all representative of the people in our party, of the voters of our party, and the people that we're trying to support. And it's a deep problem, and I'm hopeful that no matter what happens in November, that we eliminate the first in the nation status for both Iowa and New Hampshire. They're not representative at all.
Playing a little bit of a devil's advocate, I really don't have an opinion on this, but just trying to think this through, because this is one of the arguments that would happen on the Unity Reform Commission. And I try to say this to people who are like, get rid of caucuses and just have primaries. Well, there's a full range of primaries as well. There are good caucuses and bad caucuses. There are really bad primaries, and there are decent primaries. And at the end of the day, primaries are regulated by the state. So if you're in a Republican state, guess what? Republicans are now in charge of the Democratic primary process. And this was brought up because voter suppression has been used in the past. There's also states like New York where we're Democratic, but we have lower turnout because of our closed primary status. than Iowa, which is, a caucus that's hard to get to. That was pre-accessibility updates, reforms. So, but with that being said, looking at the states that have more diversity, and it's not every state. I'm looking at like Super Tuesday, for instance, Texas, California. They're also really big media markets, and so having a large state early on is really a signal to a candidate that has more money, because they're able to compete in those states, which of course the media markets are expensive. I mean, you're seeing all this money flooding into Texas when most districts in Texas are still R plus 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then they don't want to touch Wisconsin, which is really like, maybe R plus 1 or D plus 1, because the media markets in Texas are hot for consultants. So I think one of the arguments that's made is, well, at least with Iowa and New Hampshire, you can be a populist and you can still do old-fashioned campaigning. And of course, with Pete Buttigieg, that worked to his advantage. So what would be the perfect state to start off with?
I don't know. I think we need to have those sorts of discussions. I think Colorado, I think Nevada would be really representative, where you're not talking about a huge media market where it's really expensive for grassroots candidates to compete. But we never had these sorts of discussions before. They're always like, well, there's so many different options if we don't go with Iowa, New Hampshire. And instead of examining the different options, let's just do the same thing that we've always done. And I don't think that's right. I think this deserves a fuller discussion, and we can break out the data, and people who are much smarter than me can come to the DNC and to state parties, and we can figure out a much fairer process where maybe we do clusters of states where every other week we have 5 states that have an election, and that alternates every 4 years. I don't know. There's lots of different options that have been discussed just on the periphery, but we haven't had a full discussion with data that's been data informed, and that's to all of our detriment.
So you mean there needs to be like another Unity Reform Commission?
I think it makes sense to have a Unity Reform Commission or something of that type after each convention.
I agree. Yeah.
I think we need to review the DNC's bylaws, because just like the Constitution, the DNC's charter is a living document. And if it's not working, then we need to re-examine what's not working and figure out a better path forward. So I think we always should be looking at a regular pace on what reforms need to be made. Maybe some things do work and we can't improve upon it, and that's fine, but we need to have a conversation about that.
Absolutely. I have to ask this question because people are going to ask me, the superdelegate rumor about superdelegates coming back on the first ballot, tell us where that stands, and then also just explain what happens if it does go to a second ballot.
So you spoke about the Unity Reform Commission and all the reforms that came out of the URC. One of the reforms that came out of that was a version of superdelegate reform that would have created different classes of superdelegates. Essentially, it meant that elected officials would keep their superdelegate status and DNC members would not, but it would be DNC members who would vote on this reform. And the problem is you're asking DNC members to vote to get rid of their own superpower while enabling elected officials, who most of us agree were the problem not only in 2016, but in previous cycles, to keep their superdelegate status. So a good friend of mine, a DNC member from Kansas, he's the one who came up with no vote on first ballot for superdelegates. So I'm not the first DNC member to come out in support of this reform, but I was the second. And we organized around the country against that reform that was being backed by Tom Perez. We eventually garnered enough support that Perez called us into his office, and we spoke with him for 45 minutes about no vote on first ballot, why we thought that it would do more to reduce the influence of superdelegates and actually had a better chance of passing the full DNC. And thankfully he listened and he got on board. So that was the first and last time I've ever had leadership support on any reform that I've tried to pass at the DNC. We saw its effectiveness, and it did pass with over 80% of the DNC voting in favor. But there was a loud but very small minority who wanted to keep their superdelegate status. And for the most part, it was, at least from the state elected DNC members, they were older and whiter,
Yes.
and male. They were all men. And apparently, according to the Politico article, a couple of those individuals were texting one another and talking at a meeting of the DNC's executive committee about trying to change the rules to allow superdelegates to vote on the first ballot. But in order to do that, you would have to call a special meeting of the DNC, where you need 25% of the DNC to do that. They didn't even have 25% against superdelegate reform 2 years ago when we voted in favor of it. And most of the 20% who voted against superdelegate reform were quoted in that article saying, no, we have to move on. It wouldn't be fair to change the rules midstream. So there's no mechanism, there's no support of this. I think it was irresponsible for Politico to even put out an article about what a couple DNC members, random DNC members, and rumors, I mean, they might have been talking about, but you're talking at most maybe 5 who were talking about this out of 440. And these were people who were already in the minority to begin with on this issue. So it's unfortunate that we had to reopen this discussion because a lot of us, including the chair, fought really hard for these reforms, but there's no going back. For this cycle, superdelegates will not vote unless we get to a second ballot, at which point everyone, including all the pledged delegates elected from their congressional districts from the states, all of them become unpledged too. All of them essentially are superdelegates on the second ballot.
Right, that's a really important point that people, if say we go into the convention and it really is clear that there are 2 candidates who qualify for, if it's a brokered convention, say it's Bernie and Bloomberg, just making it up. And Bloomberg has a little bit fewer delegates than Bernie, suddenly Warren's delegates come up for, negotiation and Pete's delegates. And then it becomes very similar to the DNC chair's race.
Yes, it does.
Which was a crowded race for people who don't know.
Yes, and my hope is that if we do end up having a contested convention where we don't have a candidate with 50% plus on the first ballot, what will happen is the leading candidate, if in that example it would be Bernie, he would negotiate with Warren, with Pete, for their delegates, offer them positions in his cabinet as Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, even Vice President. And Bloomberg, in your example, as the second place candidate, would be doing the same thing. It's whoever makes a better offer, and then the candidate who would be receiving a job in that next administration would ask their delegates to support Bernie or Bloomberg, and it's hopefully their delegates listen to them. They don't have to, right, because again, everyone's unbound. Yeah. But it's my hope that all of that will be done even before we get to Milwaukee.
Yeah.
So if we know that we're going into a convention where no candidate has a majority on the first ballot, the second ballot will already be decided because decisions and agreements and compromises have already been made. So the superdelegates won't come into play as much as people think. That's my hope.
My hope as well. Oh my God, you're freaking me out here.
Well, in an ideal world, someone wins a majority of pledged delegates, and we don't have to worry about this. But this issue, by the way, it's going to come up again. Superdelegates reform that we passed, it's for this convention. But in 2024, leading up to that convention, we're going to have this fight again. And so maybe this is the version of reform, no vote on first ballot, that we're going to go with. Maybe there's something stronger that we can fight for that can actually pass the DNC, but I'm fully confident that no vote on first ballot was the strongest type of reform that we could have passed.
And that's the operative part, that we could have passed.
Yes, absolutely.
Michael, oh my God, I'm never surprised with the DNC. I was actually surprised about Iowa. I have been aware of the superdelegate discussion, obviously, but was a part of it, and I felt like it was always a little bit of a distraction away from the real corruption, because it's internally, it's controversial, but not as controversial as the money. So I would love to come back to you and get updates. I know there are no DNC meetings from now until the convention. How convenient. But I know there's a lot of rumblings and organizing behind the scenes. So I would love to come back to you at any other point. But thank you so much for giving us a primer and freaking us out a little bit.
Of course, I think that information is always good to share. People need to know what's going on. And I'm happy to criticize the DNC when they deserve it, when leadership deserves it. But I will always tell people the truth. And if I support leadership on something because they are not messing up, then I'll defend them too. Because again, I think it's important that everyone has the information, then they can do with it what they will.
Mm-hmm. Good luck in your election. When do people vote in California?
6 weeks.
Who votes?
The California Democratic Party's executive board. So it's about 370 people all throughout the state of California.
So much democracy. All right. Well, if you're on the executive board, or if you know an executive board member in California, I mean, we do have a lot of DNC people watching this stuff. So this is the guy. Vote for Michael.
Thank you. And thank you for everything that you do.
And if you'd like to know more about the DNC, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nomiki Konst, and of course, become a patron on Patreon/The Nomiki Show. We have some really interesting interviews planned. I will be giving you teasers, but if you're a patron, you will find out before everybody else, and possibly even help me out with questions. I've got really big interviews coming up. So make sure to tune in, and we have a show come out, a full show every single week. It goes out on Patreon on Saturday mornings, and then early on in the week on YouTube. All right, guys, thank you so much. Thank you to Michael Kapp, and good luck with the election.
Thank you.